I'm Jonathan Horn.
I'm Cody Atkinson.
And I'm Matteo Schlapek-Sevillo. And this is the 110 Percenters podcast. Hello and welcome to 110 Percenters, the footy podcast. My name is Matteo Schlapek-Sevillo and I write the 1 Percenters newsletter. I'm joined this week by Cody Atkinson of the ABC. Cody, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. How are you going?
Yeah, really well, thanks, mate. And Jonathan Horn of The Guardian. Jonathan, how are you?
Very well. Typically quiet week in footy.
Yeah, you could say that. We're back for our second episode. It's safe to say that we've been blown away by the reception to last week's debut. Thank you so much to everyone who listened and who shared their thoughts. We're really full of ideas about how to improve the show, and we're really excited to get better. Even by the standards of the AFL, it was an action-packed week. The top team lost, the bottom team won. North Melbourne won a game after the siren. GWS kicked the biggest third quarter score in history against the back-to-back premiers, no less, and Scott Pendlebury broke the league's games record. Yet we're only going to talk about one of those things this week. This week on 110 Percenters, we'll discuss the Giants' extraordinary, record-breaking third quarter against the Lions and Essendon's shock, in inverted commas, decision to sack coach Brad Scott. But we begin in the only place we can. On Monday afternoon, news broke that Neil Daniher had passed away after his 13-year battle with motor neuron disease. Born as one of 11 children in West Wyalong, New South Wales, Daniher rose to prominence with his brothers Terry, Chris and Anthony playing for Essendon. After 82 games over 11 injury-riddled years, including, famously, a game where all four Daniher brothers played together, Neil went into coaching. He made his name at the Melbourne Football Club, where he was senior coach from 1998 to 2007, including taking the Demons to the 2000 Grand Final. Nicknamed the Reverend for his passionate public speaking, Daniher was diagnosed with motor neuron disease in 2013 and publicly announced his illness the year after when he founded his charity Fight MND. Since then, he'd helped to raise more than $117 million toward the fight against the cruel disease he called the Beast. In recognition for his unstinting advocacy, Daniher was named Australian of the Year in 2025. Neil Daniher is survived by his wife Jan, his children Beck, Ben, Lauren and Luke, and their families. He was just 65. Guys, I think it's right that we open the show this week with just our remembrances and our reminiscences of Neil, this great man, this talented player, this excellent coach, and this inspiration. So, Jonathan, perhaps you have the first word.
Yeah, look, Matteo, really an interesting man who has obviously done extraordinary things which have been really well documented, but I'm also really interested in the upbringing that he had and the life that he led as a young man in the sort of really tough farming stock that he comes from, and that upbringing, and it's something that he covered in his biography, but how that upbringing of his, which was a really tough one, and how that's sort of held him instead for the fight that was to come. And it was the Danihers were people who didn't complain, who just did what they had to do. And you even see that today. I heard Terry interviewed this morning talking about his brother, and it was very much that attitude of, yeah, mate, we just get on with it. Whatever life throws at you, you take and you adapt and you respond. And that was the sort of farming ethos that Danihers had, and something that Neil took into his playing, into his coaching, but most of all into the struggle that he had against this horrible disease that you wouldn't wish on anyone, and that he has done more than anyone to sort of bring to the public light.
Yeah, really well said. Cody, really keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, look, Neil was a quite immense man on the Australian landscape over the last 30 years of public life, but particularly since his diagnosis. It's a bit strange. In the English-speaking world, there's three people to have MND or ALS that have sort of become synonymous with the disease. Lou Gehrig's disease is how ALS is known in the US, and they've got the ice bucket challenges and similar. We've had that come to Australia with Neil Daniher's advocacy, and of course Stephen Hawking in the UK famously persevered and created some earth-changing work while with it. All three men continued their work post-diagnosis. The diagnosis didn't define them. They looked to improve the outcomes for others after that. remember reading, even before Neil Danaher's diagnosis, Lou Gehrig's Luckiest Man speech is considered one of the finest pieces of public oration in a very long time. He considered himself, lucky for the life that he led and what he still had time to do. And that's how Neil, I think, approached it. I'll give you a quick personal reflection too. I grew up unfortunately in one of the worst ways you can, as a Demons fan. Not only as a Demons fan, but a Demons fan. We moved to Queensland when I was quite young. So it was really hard being a fan of maybe the most snake-bitten team and in a state that didn't really care about the thing that you were snake-bitten about. But Neil Danaher's coaching provided sort of, I guess, some advocacy. By 2000, he'd turned around the club. Like, him and John Northey did as much to turn around the Melbourne Football Club as any two people post Norm Smith. The impact that he had in a footballing sense was huge, but the impact he had off the field was much larger. Matteo, what do you think? What's your legacy of Neil?
I don't remember Neil Danaher, the player, because he finished up in the year I was born. But I do remember Neil Danaher, the coach. And, of course, you remember everything from when you were 6 to 10 years old. So I remember Neil Danaher in 1998. And I have this distinct memory of a lot of his tenure as Melbourne coach being characterised by these sort of seesawing seasons. He'd have an up year, he'd have a down year. But there are so many iconic names attached, I think, to that team. Farmer, Neitz, Schwartz, Uze, perhaps a little later, names like Bruce and Green, Robertson, I guess, and the Reverend was sort of in the middle of it. And he was this kind of, for kid me, this almost impossibly charismatic presence. And I understand the Reverend was based partly on the evangelising that he did for this sort of stricken Melbourne Football Club. And obviously you were alluding to that, Cody. Jonathan, really keen, for you to come in again.
Yeah, and just on him as a coach, I mean, he wasn't this knockabout country coach, nice guy, cracking wisecracks and so on. He was a brutal coach, Neil Danaher, and a lot of his former players have spoken about that in the last 24 hours about, that they haven't shirked away from the fact that he ended a lot of their careers. Yeah. He was a brutal man in terms of the feedback he gave to players, but he had that ability to still maintain their respect, even when he was sacking them, and especially given the fight he had later in life. And his former players, who a lot of them were terrified of him when he was coaching, have been the first ones to sort of come out and just mourn this man and speak so glowingly of him for the last 10 or 15 years.
I think you alluded to something like that in your wonderful piece that you wrote last year about Neil, Jonathan, about this Neil kind of wryly remarking on the fact that, he was this bastard of a coach, and then, he was in that box, and then he got his diagnosis, and all of a sudden he was the sort of the hero. He was kind of in that box, and it's almost as though his actual sort of footy legacy as this in some ways kind of quite ruthless coach who could strip the paint off the walls was forgotten, because all of a sudden he was kind of put into I guess in a way into a victim box, and I don't think we quite have time to really interrogate that part of this subject. This is a kind of
it's the duality of man, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the fact that we can have multiple facilities. As tough he was as a coach, he thought he was making the right decision to make the lives of his team and the fans that believe in the Melbourne Football Club happier.
Yeah.
Here's one for you, Jonathan. I was always told as a kid that Neil was the most talented Danaher as a player. You probably had a bit more opportunity to see him on the field than Matteo and myself. Is that accurate? Is that how you remember it?
Well, I'm pretty old, Cody, but the problem with Neil was that few of us ever got to see him. That was the thing, is he missed about 6, 7 or 8 years of his prime.
Did his ACL 3 times?
Did he? And that was at a time when you did your ACL back then. It was,
they brought out the curtain.
That was pretty much it. It was very rare to come back from 2 of them, let alone 3. And he sort of, Sheedy, to his credit, sort of got him to the line right at the end in 1990 there. But no, so I've only seen him on replay, but people like Tim Watson and Sheedy themselves sort of speak of what could have been, and I think that, to his credit, he was a man who moved on from his life really quickly from that. He went and he studied theology for a year, but he also went and became a computer programmer and also a really, really well-renowned, tactically astute assistant coach. So he did move on very quickly.
And I think someone like Neil, to me, when I think about Danaher and his impact, and it is obviously so inseparable today from his advocacy for that horrible disease, but I think a lot about the fact that the AFL throws I guess, visions and ideas and concepts of masculinity and manhood at us all the time. And there are these sort of aggressive and alpha winner type personalities that obviously are valorized a lot in footy. And I think Neil represents something else, something I think a little bit more stoic, something a little bit more introspective. And I was just constantly admiring, I think, of his, I guess, ability to take such an awful diagnosis kind of in stride, at least publicly, and to turn this, I'm sure, of course, this hardship into something so productive and so constructive. And I think that ability to take that in stride is what, for me, made him a hero. I think we have to wrap up this segment, but it's worth saying that Neil will be honoured with a state funeral in Victoria in the coming weeks. The annual Fire MND Big Freeze game between Melbourne and Collingwood will be played on Monday, 8th of June. It'll be an especially sombre occasion this year. I'd like to just end by reading this excerpt from Neil's Australian of the Year speech that he gave last year. I chose to fight because if I didn't, how could I expect anyone else to? I chose to hope because I believe in the decency and generosity of Australians. I thought if people truly understood the challenges we face, they'd join the fight with me. And you have. Oh, how you have. So again, I thank you. No, Neil, we thank you. Vale. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters.
We're back on 110 Percenters, and we are changing tack from one Neil to another. And it was a very unhappy 33rd birthday for Lockie on Sunday. His Brisbane Lions travelled to NG Stadium, still smarting from a 7-goal defeat at home to Geelong the previous Thursday. For the first half, things proceeded more or less as normal, given this matchup. The Giants, who've given the Lions trouble in the recent past, led a free-scoring game by a goal at half-time. They then came out of the changing rooms to pile on an astonishing 14-0 in the third quarter, shocking the footy world. And they did it while being a couple of players down on the bench, not to mention all the other injury-enforced absences that have impacted their season to date. Brisbane looked shell-shocked. The Giants kicked so many goals that the beginning of the Western Bulldogs versus Nam game had to be delayed by about 3 minutes. We're going to talk about that extraordinary third quarter and what it might mean for these two sides for the rest of the year. And there is no better place to begin, Cody, than with the excellent article that you and your ABC colleague, Sean Lawson, wrote about this yesterday. Please tell us about that article, about what you discovered, and about this astonishing 30-something minutes of footy.
Yeah, look, it's one of those ones, and Sunday afternoon football is one of the rare joys in life. It's hard to think that all the games are played at the same time. Well, certainly my early years, you could only watch one, and we were talking about Diesels right on the tip of my tongue. You'd hear that before the last quarter replays for the other games. This is one that benefits from the modern generation because there was chats going on, and you have to watch the Giants game right now. You have to watch what's happening between the Giants and the Lions. It's not something you see every day, but in the same sense, we've sort of seen the same thing before. A couple of years ago, before the Lions' first premiership, the Giants took them to the sword in a similar sort of thumping display, beat them by 52 points, and everyone was writing the Lions off. And we all know how that movie ended. This time was a bit different, though, because the Giants did everything that you would do to ordinarily interrupt the Lions. They made it really hard to escape from defense. So when you defend the ground, you want to prevent teams from getting into space, ideally the corridor, but you want them to make the ground, you want to make the ground smaller when you're defending teams. The Lions are so good at opening up the play by hitting either the corridor or the edges of the corridor. That makes the ground bigger, harder to defend. That's why they get so many uncontested marks per game. For the last 3 years, 4 years, they've led the league in that measure. That's why the Lions look like they can move the ball so effortlessly. It's because they get more set time to do so. The Giants just put pressure on the ball carriers. So the Giants haven't really had forward continuity all year. Jesse Hogan missed this game. They haven't had a game with the same forward six all year. This one was a smaller, more agile one. So they were able to put pressure on the ball carrier on that first kick out of defense that forced really, really bad kicks to the corridor or kicks to tall defenders down the line. When that doesn't go well for the Lions, when they can't get easy ball, they need to win stoppage to win territory. So their Harris Andrews and the like can trap the ball up forward. And the Lions actually won more centre clearances in the third quarter. They couldn't do anything with them, though, because the Giants midfielders were willing to do the work extra hard to prevent the Lions from doing damage. I remember the comms said that Oliver had a quiet quarter because he only had 2 disposals right late in the quarter. But he had an immense work rate. He worked really hard to prevent them getting free. I don't know what else it means longer term, and I'll sort of leave it there.
Yeah. I mean, that's just such a fabulous wrap up. Thank you, Cody. Jonathan, look, a little bit. Let's put this quarter into some context. The highest scoring third quarter in VFL/AFL history, the highest scoring against the reigning premier, and the 4th highest scoring quarter overall. It ended up being GWS's highest ever score. Of course, they've usually, particularly in their infancy, they were on the receiving end of scorelines like that. To be honest, watching that, and Cody alluded to this idea of it was one of those events that made you sit up and take notice and text your mates and all of that. It reminded me of Germany beating Brazil 7-1 in the semi-final of the 2014 World Cup in Brazil. It felt a little bit like that sort of magnitude, particularly against a sort of very fancied, famous opponent. Jonathan, I guess tell me about your thoughts watching it or hearing about it, and what a result like that did to change your views of what either of these teams can do this year.
Well, I was out walking the dog at the time, so I've taken the dog out, and 15 minutes later I've come back and the whole world's gone berserk. Incredible. And I have this sort of very perilous Sunday deadline column where it's often quite hard to sort of work out which game I'm going to cover and so on. And I wasn't really going to do that game, but it was just a must to do that game after that quarter. Look, I think that there's been a lot of talk this week about, is this the end of their run this year? Is this sort of a sign of something quite that they're in a lot of trouble? It reminds me in some ways of Geelong in 2023, of a team that's sort of picking and choosing a bit, a team that's been hit hard by injuries, and that's just starting to show some worrying signs. I don't think there's any concern long term for Brisbane. I think the way their list is constructed and everything like that is just perfect. They are in a great spot. But again, there's been comparisons, and Cody alluded to it before, of that game in 2024, which was in Canberra. Was it Cody? I think it was.
Yeah.
It was. Anzac Night in 2024. The crucial thing about that game is that Brisbane came away from that game. Obviously, they were well beaten, and the Giants have always been the sort of team that can put a team to the sword, like few others. And they did it that night, obviously. But the crucial thing there was that Brisbane actually thought that their game was in really good order that year. They were actually, They were 2 wins from 7, but they went to the bye, which was, I think, a few weeks later, really confident that they could turn it around. They were having all sorts of problems with inaccuracy. They'd had a really tough draw in the first month or so, and they just had a couple of games where sort of everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But they kind of backed their system and their talent and things like that. And Fagan used to talk like that after games. We're actually in a really good place, and everyone sort of looked at them and thought, really? I don't hear them talking like that now. I think that there's more.
It would be more believable if Fagan was saying that today, because they've got two premierships under their belt, right?
Well, that's it. And I think that's a lot of, it's almost this belief system in Brisbane is based on that. But structurally, and the data is sort of showing some worrying signs that weren't there in 2024, and certainly weren't there last year when they were a much more even, balanced team last year.
Yeah, Cody, I really want to dig into this, and you're obviously the tactical expert among us, so I think you're the person to kind of litigate this or have this debate with. I feel torn between having this high level of trust in Brisbane, given the fact they've done it. They've made 3 consecutive grand finals. They are back-to-back premiers, and that kind of, I guess, institutional trust. This is a team that have danced on ice before, famously. But the numbers are not looking good. I was in preparation for our next segment about Essendon, looking up the fact that, Essendon are pretty much bottom in all of the defending transition statistics. Well, you know what? Brisbane are 17th in a lot of those same statistics. They're currently 17th for preventing their opposition going from D50 to forward 50. Teams have been thinking about how to beat this Lions side for 18 months. The Giants... Of course, the Giants have had luck, or they've played very, very well, and they've posed problems to Brisbane before, forcing that kind of ground ball game. What do you think, Cody? The Lions look so loose defensively at the moment. Are they in trouble?
Yeah, look, and I'll just hop on something that Jonathan said. I was there at that Giants game 2024, and we chatted to Fags after that one. And Fagan was cool as a cucumber. Like, he was agitated that they'd lost by so much, but he was like, look, we're not playing as bad a footy as the numbers suggest. Like, and there was a lot of people calling for Hipwood's head at the time. And he was actually providing contests. It's hard when you're not doing well, when things aren't bouncing your way. The result on Sunday was not balls bouncing the wrong way. There was like, they kicked unerringly lucky. Like, it was the best ever kicking quarter that the Giants had that we've ever seen. But even if you take away that luck, they were still going to be beaten by 8 goals. Right? They were just thoroughly beaten. I say Hipwood for a good reason. Hipwood's not in the team. He's probably their most important forward. I know Morris kicks a lot of goals, but you have a look at the spread of targets inside 50, and it's about as lopsided as any other team. They desperately need another tall forward.
Yep.
Their other guy is Oscar Allen. He's not fit right now, so they need to get that forward structure. That's critical for them. They've got a numbers crunch through the middle of the ground. They've got too much talent looking for either centre bounce or secondary stoppage opportunities.
What a problem. What a problem to have. Too much talent.
Yeah. The one thing coaches say these days is it's about continuity and it's about knowing your role. And you'll see the different coloured stickers on the coaching whiteboards and like the different midfield roles that you can play. If you don't know who's doing what, it's really hard to get on the same page. And if you've got either injury absence or intense competition for positions, you often lose that continuity. And one more down back, they still missing Jack Payne. They've still got Lester, I believe, is still out. They're not firing on all cylinders fitness wise, and it doesn't sound like a lot of people. And on paper, the Giants are probably missing more, but it's about the resilience. And the Lions have had a pretty continuous run. They've had Coleman's been in and out, and there've been other injuries. Neil came back at the last minute last year, but they've had a pretty blessed run. The hope for Brisbane now is that it's a personnel issue, that it's a continuity and personnel issue. It's not a game plan strategy issue. Yes. Because if it's a game plan strategy issue, they're running out of time quite rapidly. If it's a personnel sort of continuity thing, they've got a bit more reflexiveness there.
Yeah, well, matchups, of course, are so important in this sport. With this result now, it means that the Giants have won 4 out of their last 5 against the Lions, and the one they dropped was that infamous semi-final where they were 40-something points up, 7 goals up at home, only to drop that game. The variance also makes narratives. It's funny to think of, I should put my cards on the table. We should put our cards on the table. 110% is a pro Eric Hipwood podcast, and we're a pro expected score podcast. Had the game gone according to expected
Jonathan
score?
Are you pro Hipwood?
I'm certainly a pro expected score man. Eric, I've taken a bit of convincing over the years. I sort of do respect the view around his structural importance and things like that. And I must admit, I was one of those people who got caught up in the wider narrative around Eric at various times. Maybe I could have written some harsh things about him in the 2023 grand final, which I could potentially get the editors to sort of scrap in hindsight.
Yeah, just retroactively edit that bit.
Yeah, look, and I agree with both of you on their defence, players and Answorth, and also just not having Zorko there. I know Zorko is a polarising figure for many reasons, but he is so important to them when they're going well, both emotionally and structurally.
Well, and he's an organiser as well of that defence. Him and Harris Andrews, that experience is so crucial. What I was going to say, speaking of expected score, had this game gone exactly according to expected score, the Giants would have won by 44 points. A big win, a very comfortable win, which you alluded to before, Cody. But wouldn't have felt as epochal, I guess, in the way that this result felt because, obviously 14 goals to 0, 86 points to 3. I should say, we've been talking about the Lions. Let's talk about the Giants. Cody, I count myself as a little bit of a Giant skeptic. They are a very high variance, high volatility team. They can do this. They can also drop strange games and look, well, not especially impressive, I think. So especially given the injuries that they've suffered coming into the season, I was quite skeptical of their credentials. They have improved in a couple of really important metrics, I think, so far this season that I certainly wasn't expecting. As you and Sean pointed out in your piece, they're currently the number 1 team in the AFL for post-contest ground ball gets by a significant margin, more than twice as much of the Dogs. So this is a team that if they can force a sort of ground ball game and get that numbers moving forward of the contest, as we saw on Sunday, they are so dangerous. They are obviously still, deprived of some pretty key personnel. What did you see on Sunday that might make someone more bullish about the Giants?
Yeah, and it's a hard one, right? I guess the case for optimism for the Giants is they're pretty much as rooted in a footballing ideology as any other team. And the fingerprints of where Kingsley worked for 16 years as an assistant coach before coming in. We might talk about James Hird, who's summed up 6 weeks as an assistant coach, and that was after his first run as the Dons, mentor. Kingsley has been able to shape his footballing brain, and we can't forget that he won the world's smartest footballer on Channel 10, I think back in 2009.
Well, of course.
So so he's a pretty clued in guy.
Well, and surely, sorry to interrupt, Cody. I'm just going to make a little trivial point again to follow on from your bit of trivia about Kingsley. Now with Michael Voss gone, he's probably the coach that boasts the biggest bench press in the AFL, I reckon.
I think Bevo might.
Bevo. Yeah, Bevo. No, fair enough.
Bevo looks like a man who's been deadlifting for the last 20 years these days.
Kingsley is a big man. Like you're in the same room as him. There was early footage of Kingsley with a stress ball that Channel 7 put in, and he's like crushing this stress ball and throwing it against the wall.
I remember the Kingsley stress ball.
And that's when he realised he had to go to the boundary side, so they couldn't catch him like that, for at least for a few weeks. I think the case for optimism is that their game plan, the theory works, and it's just sort of weight of numbers, forcing ground balls, and they do so much to make sure that they're in the right position, so either front and centre or behind the ball to protect. And I think that's the case for optimism. Also that they're connecting. Like I was told that the Giants work as a country footy club, and at country footy clubs, when things are going well, it's humming, things work, you start to win. At a country footy club, they're about the most miserable places you can be if you're getting beaten by 10 goals, So I think the case for optimism is in that. And I will say that Kingsley looked like a happy man after the game. I saw some post-game interviews and he's necking a beer in the background with Jason McCartney, and things seem to be going, pretty well.
I'd say after you've touched up the reigning premiers by 13 goals, including putting 14 on them in the third quarter, you would be pretty happy, even if you are, like Adam Kingsley, a bit hard to please. Listeners, hopefully you aren't so hard to please. We're going to have to leave it there. We're going to be right back after a little break.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters.
Welcome back to 110 Percenters. You're with me, Matteo Schlappek-Savillo, Cody Atkinson and Jonathan Horn. The footy world awoke to the news on Tuesday that Brad Scott had been relieved of his duties as Essendon coach effective immediately. This was both a surprise and not at all a surprise. On one hand, rebuilding clubs are giving their coaches more leeway. On the other, Essendon was a mess and only showing the vaguest signs of improvement. There had been rumblings about Scott's future for some time, and following a 3-goal loss to Richmond at the Dreamtime at the G game, those rumblings intensified. Several prominent journalists, including Carolyn Wilson, predicted that Scott would get sacked around the bye, and so it's proven. Scott departs with Essendon bottom of the ladder, having won just one of its 11 games in 2026 and one of its last 25. His record as Essendon's head coach will forever read: played 80, won 29, drawn 1, lost 50. The sacking means that 2026 is the first season since 2019 where 2 head coaches have left their positions before the bye, and in 2019, Carlton sacked their coach, and then Brad Scott left his role. Then it was as head coach of North Melbourne, this time, of course, as head coach of Essendon. Just a couple of hours before we recorded, it was confirmed that Dean Solomon had been appointed Essendon's interim head coach. A very, very fascinating choice. Jonathan, Essendon have been publicly signalling for about a year now they're committed to a deep rebuild. They've overhauled their high-performance department and their footy operations department. They've gone to the draft. It was widely acknowledged that the end of last season was a mulligan due to that catastrophic list of injuries. Yet now Brad Scott is gone, 11 weeks into the season. Why? What's changed?
Well, it's an interesting question to ask what changed after Gather Round when both the president and the CEO rushed to the 2 major Melbourne metropolitan newspapers and said that Brad Scott was going to be the next premiership coach at Essendon, which was an extraordinary move, even after a win like that, a win that sort of came out of nowhere. So, I mean, the question really has to be asked, well, what changed since then? And I think in that time since then, they had 2 losses against Gold Coast and GWS where they actually played really well. And they were 2 games that they could have pinched. But what has really sort of stamped Scott's cards, I think, is 3 losses at the MCG. And to be at those games and the mood of the supporter base, and let's face it, Essendon supporters are a unique bunch in terms of what they've been through, their passion, their commitment, but their disenchantment with the coach, a coach that, let's face it, they never warmed to. I don't think Brad Scott ever had the sort of support of the Essendon faithful. I think deep down there was always this suspicion, just as there was at North Melbourne towards the end, that he was that he was an outsider, that he was not one of them, and Essendon people like their own in charge at the club. And I just think that the mood at those games, that Fremantle game in the wet, there were 25,000 odd people there that day, and at least half of those seemed to go home at half time of that game. That game was a disaster for Essendon and for Scott. And look, the final sort of calling card seemed to have been that loss to Richmond, but really he can consider himself pretty unlucky to be cut on the basis of that. I mean, his captain breaks his jaw. Another young player is rushed to hospital with a lacerated kidney. He's got Guelphy out of the game within 90 seconds. He's got another player, was it Caldwell, who was basically unable to move all game.
Yeah, he was on one leg, yep.
And Richmond played really well that night, and that's it for Brad Scott. Look, the disappointment generating machine that is Essendon, it just keeps giving. It's going to be interesting to see what happens next.
On that, Cody, Essendon's president, Andrew Welsh, former player, of course, gave a press conference earlier today. Again, we're recording on a Tuesday, where he didn't so much leave the door ajar for James Hird as maybe flung open the door for James Hird when asked directly about about accusations that Essendon are run a little bit like a boys' club still, with the coteries and the influence of former players. He talked about the fact that, well, Sam Mitchell has gone back to Hawthorn. Justin Longmuir has gone back to Fremantle. Josh Carr has gone back to Port Adelaide. Good Essendon people have a role at the Essendon Football Club. Cody, do you think this is all leading up to James Hird completing what he clearly believes is unfinished business at the Bombers?
I think people can want a lot of things in life. I wanted to win Powerball last week, and here I am on this podcast with you two. I think Hird has an immense football brain. We've seen him talk about football in the past. Quite clearly, he was not the most physically or athletically talented player. That's why he slid in the draft to the spot he did. He worked hard. Undoubtedly a good football person. Is he a good senior coach of a football club? That's where the questions start. I'm not going to get the justice for the 34 people involved in this, but the Essendon doping scandal needs to be mentioned here. He came back after that and had a bad year as a coach. I don't think there's much in the current way that football is being played that you could look at James Hird as an influence strategically to the direction of the game. Scott, I think he had a really hard run at Essendon. He ran out of players last year. He's had, as Jonathan mentioned, a lot of injuries this year, but it's not worked out for him. I think Hird would be an interesting call. You mentioned Dean Solomon has been appointed caretaker.
Yep, let's go there. Let's talk about Dean Solomon.
Yeah, well, Dean Solomon, of course. I think this is the second caretaker appointment directly from the board, and I had to scratch my brain here. And Jonathan probably can correct me if I'm wrong, but Grant Thomas rings a bell, I think, came from the St Kilda board to do the caretaker gig and took over there.
Correct.
So it's not unprecedented. Yeah, it's not unprecedented here. But being mentioned in that category, that's 2001. This is generational.
Well, and sorry, let's be really clear here, right? Last season, Dean Solomon was on the Essendon board of directors. This season, all of a sudden, he's moved into a coaching role overseeing the team defence and the back line, which I think it's safe to say has not really gone so well. Cody, you spoke about James Hird probably not really being strategically kind of fit for purpose for senior coaching in 2026. What should give Essendon fans any kind of faith or belief that Dean Solomon is?
Look, I think Dean Solomon, at least at one point of his career, was a pretty highly credentialed assistant coach up at the Gold Coast, and that's when he got his last caretaker gig. Look, I'm not willing to put a hard line through James Hurd's strategic knowledge, and maybe he has learnt stuff at Port Melbourne, maybe he learnt stuff at GWS, and he's got a good football brain. I just don't think the case is strong enough to bring him back after a relatively unsuccessful coaching run. I think if he'd won several premierships last time he was in charge, or won a final, like, I think you could make a stronger argument. But we're talking about a guy who's still skating off the reputation as a great of the game. I'm not sure I've seen anything or heard anything that calls him a master coach to the point that you'd sack a coach this early in the season to give him a run. I think it's odd how Solomon is in charge of potentially the weakest unit. Assistant coaches do work cross lines, but I don't think you'd say their defense is better when adjusting for personnel. There's that element there, but yeah. Jonathan?
It's interesting that both Solomon and Hurd are in many ways quintessential Sheedy men. They were, you know, one was this just sublimely skilled player, and one was just this hard player, the sort of player that the sort of players that Sheedy loved and that Essendon supporters love, and that connection.
He was a hard nut. Commentators used to talk about hard nuts all the time.
Yeah, he
was.
was.
And Dean Solomon was one of those.
And he was also just the typical, and Sheedy was always unearthing these sort of players in the 80s, and obviously Solomon came later. But I think, did he come from Broken Hill? I think he didn't. Sheedy just loved players like that. He loved your tradies and your farmers and your tough. You know, he didn't really like your school teachers and your professionals. And that's why he was a little bit wary of James Hurd at first. And I guess I'm talking about that connection that Hurd has with the fan base. And there's some really, really good judges who are saying to me, no, we need to do this. We need to get him back. And you, as Cody was saying before, it's been 11 years since he coached. His second stint at Essendon was an absolute disaster. That 2015 year, that entire club was broken, and he was broken. Now, the question has to be asked, what has changed in 11 years where the game has basically gone through about 2 or 3 iterations since then, that he's got to sort of sweep back in as this messiah figure and sort everything out? They would be absolutely kidding themselves if they do this.
Well, I think the perhaps cynical answer to your question, Jonathan, about what's happened is that there's been 11 years of perhaps James Hurd's sense that he was thwarted in some way by the supplement saga and by the turmoil around Essendon, the entire club at the time, that meant that he has unfinished business. And you might say that in a more institutionally stable, more functional club, the wishes of an extremely influential, legendary ex-player, premiership player, Brownlow medalist, etc., wouldn't hold so much sway that you're not going to make a choice of, you know, likely head coach based on the intensity of the ardor of one man to get that job, that you're actually going to run something like an impartial process. Cody, really keen to hear your thoughts about, let's say that Essendon, you know, do run, I guess, an open and transparent process. Do you think maybe there's a kind of profile of coach looking at their list, looking at where they are in the basement of the rebuild, that they should be looking to get?
Yeah, I think in our unreleased pilot episode, we talked about taking on a old football club like Carlton. What's the draws to that? And what at Essendon, it's a similar thing, except for Carlton kind of sticks with their coaches slightly longer. Rutten made finals and was out within 2 years. Scott, 3.5 years. They're not giving long runways. So if you were trying to take, I think there's a really rich crop of assistant coaches out there that you could pair with maybe a Longmire as mentor, sorry.
And what we're thinking, maybe what James Kelly, Corey and Wright, these are names who are often touted as future head coaches.
There's just so many, and I think Jonathan can rattle off a few more, but Brent Montgomery at GWS, that Chaplin, who had a quick stint at Melbourne last year, is probably not miles off. There's guys out there that who have level 4 or the elite coaching credentials that you could give interviews to and pair with a successful former coach and get the right pathway. I think the difficulty there is how committed are Essendon to the rebuild, because the signals were before the sacking that they were going to accept not winning games as long as the development was there. As Jonathan said, I think they've actually been playing pretty good footy since then, adjusting for the quality of their list and who they've had available. I just find it relatively rash in a time where football clubs are being increasingly patient and should be patient.
And this is almost the first time where there actually has been clarity at Essendon that they are rebuilding. I mean, they were in denial that they were rebuilding for about 2 years there. They would never come out and say it. And it was only really this year that they started. Brad Scott used to hint at it, but he'd never come right out and say it. And it was almost like, we're doing a bit of a restump, and it was never quite the full deal. Well, the new coach would at least have that clarity. And this is really important when it comes to Essendon, so would the supporter base, because they would all be on board with that. And they were never really on board with what Brad was doing, and nor were the senior players, who sort of warrant their own separate podcast when it comes to what's gone wrong at Essendon. But there was never that total clarity, and I think there would be now.
If Herd took over, though, there wouldn't be that grace period. You'd expect results straight away, right, Jonathan?
We would on the 110%ers podcast, of course, Cody. But yeah, look, they're a volatile beast, the Essendon supporter base.
No coach has coached as many games with a worse win rate than Brad Scott. And only one other coach, Ken Hinkley, has coached in more than 260 games and not made a grand final. Scott had the worst win rate of any Essendon coach with more than 50 games since Jack Baggott in 1939. Can't say I'm especially familiar with that name. 1939, probably not a great time to do a rebuild. Maybe even worse than 2026. That's all for this part. We will be right back.
You're listening to 110%ers.
Listeners, nuanced, long-form discussions are nice, but hot takes, they're really where it's at. And if we're going to participate in the Footy Podcast Industrial Complex, then we'd better begin acting like it. So we're going to try a new quickfire discussion segment. And this week it's going to be ultra quickfire. One host asks, two hosts answer. This is From the Hip.
From the Hip.
Question number 1 to Cody and Jonathan. Are the 10-1 Dockers flag favourites? Jonathan.
Not for me. I think that there is a history of ladder leaders at this time of year not going on to win the flag. But my God, I hope they do get there. It'd be great for footy if Fremantle win one after 30 years. Worth remembering the Doomsayers at this time last year. They were in a hole this time last year. They'd been obliterated by St Kilda. Mm-hmm. So, look, they're in a really great spot, but not flag favourites for mine.
Cody.
Yeah, I want to see a bit more, so it's a heave no from me. I think Geelong are probably the team to beat right now, and it's hard to go past Sydney and Hawthorn. I'd probably have Freo in that mix, but I don't think it's a clear favouritism. I'll ask the next one. Mateo, did Tyler Young's push on Jamie Elliott merit the scuffle that followed?
We actually spoke about this a little bit after the game, Cody. There was a discussion that we were part of, because initially it was something that, to be honest, I barely noticed. It was junk time. I was, of course, focused on Elliott and the scuffle, and it took me a couple of replays to see that, well, Tyler Young does give him that little shove mid-air, and maybe it's the kind of thing that happens innocuously dozens of times a game, and you sort of don't really notice it. You notice it when the injury happens. I'm not saying it's a reportable incident. I'm not saying he should get weeks, but a guy is really, really vulnerable when they're in the air like that, when they're about to land. Don't shove a guy when they're in the air like that. Jonathan.
Yeah, and let's not forget that Scott Pendlebury sees everything on the footy field, and he saw something that was amiss. And look, just on that was a horrible moment to see Jamie Elliott hurt.
Yeah.
He's one of my favourite players, like as a neutral. Love watching him play, and to see him sort of crumpled in that forward pocket. Just a horrible moment on what had been a really, really sort of well-played out day.
Yep, agreed. Last one, we are going to have to cut the segment slightly short this week. Listeners, Cody, is the Josh Fraser bounce real or not? 2-0.
I think it's really interesting to hear the Carlton players and Fraser himself say that it's just a continuation of what we had going on. I watched them play. I don't think they're doing a ton differently. So maybe they're lifting a bit because they realize, a lot of players are realizing that their jobs might be at stake for next year. I want to see a few more weeks. I think the Blues are largely the same team with more luck rather than less. Jonathan.
Yeah, we haven't got another David Teague situation here, have we? Let's hope not. I see Grant Thomas says that he should be the next senior coach, which is always a worry. But look, they were
Grant
a team.
Thomas should be.
No, well, he probably thinks he should be. He thinks he should be doing a lot of things. Look, they were a team that was playing with a boulder on its shoulder under Voss, and they're playing this unburdened football. But yeah, we've seen what happened with Teague, so extreme caution at this stage.
Listeners, I think that's about all we have time for today. I can now officially say that you can find 110 Percenters wherever you get your podcasts. I'm also obliged to ask that you rate and review the show. It apparently makes it easier to find. And please tell us the truth. Did we get an important fact wrong? Did you enjoy From the Hip? How do you like our stings? You can write to me at hello@1percenters.net.au. You can find each of us on Twitter. I'll post the episode to my Substack, and you can also share your thoughts in the comments section. Until next week, I've been Matteo.
I've been Jonathan.
And I've been Cody.
And we're the 110 Percenters.